How's that? What I want to talk about is when I first learned about cloud computing. Cloud computing. The first time I ever heard of cloud computing was when I moved back to Chicago after 10 years in Houston. And I was glad to be back in Chicago because my mother's health was starting to fail. She had been a cigarette smoker, but had given it up 40 years prior. But I think cigarette smoking will catch up with you sooner or later. And it caught up with her, and she had emphysema, and it was now going towards end stage. So I was glad to be there. And my sisters and I would rotate. We had a caregiver during the day, and my sisters and I would rotate to be with her at night. So one morning at breakfast, we're talking, and she says, you know, I think I'm going to move everything to the cloud. And I'm thinking, what does this mean? Because I never heard. And, you know, being a clergy person and being a Carmelite, you know, cloud is a euphemism for heaven, you know, playing the, and I'm thinking, Mom, I tell her, Mom, I don't think it works that way. And she goes, huh? I just opened an account. This is a real story. And so I'm saying, huh? Back to her. And so she explains to me what cloud computing is. Here she's in her mid-80s, at the end, you know, emphysema, end stage, on oxygen, moving slow, needing round the clock, and she's teaching me, and I consider myself kind of like a geek, you know, a true geek, and she's teaching me cloud computing and what it means. And what had happened was, what made her like this mega geek, that she was when I was newly ordained, my very first assignment was a parish in New Jersey. And she and my father wanted to visit, so they decided Holy Week. And I thought, what a great idea. Bad idea. Holy Week in a parish, you know, was super happening. And now you have to entertain. So I'm thinking, what can I, you know, you got RCIA, you got rehearsals, you got church set up, you got all this stuff. And now I got my parents there. But you have worship aids. So I gave my mother to use a laptop. It was a Toshiba monochrome, like 11-pound, this was before Windows, it only ran DOS. You know, and could you put together the worship aids? Well, she didn't even want to touch it. I said, you can't break it, anything that happens, it can be reloaded. And it was in the days before Windows, so you just typed up the text, and when you printed it, was the first time you knew what it looked like. So she printed up a letter, typed up a letter, it looked good. So she worked at it, and she produced the worship aids for Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, and Sunday on it. So I was happy because they were busy, and I could do the work of the parish. And she learned a lot in those few days. So on Easter Monday, they're getting ready to leave. And I look at her and say, would you like that laptop? And I could see in her eyes she did. So we bundled it up with a little inkjet printer, and she took it back. Well, what she would do is, she had worked when she was a young woman for a lawyer that they'd grown up together in town, a small town in Indiana. So she worked for them until she got married and had a family. And she would work for them like when the regular secretaries would be on vacation, she'd come in to fill in because she knew the office. So that summer they asked her to come in. And so she arrives, she takes the typewriter off the desk, puts it on the floor, and puts up her Toshiba laptop, you know, and it was so cool. I love that laptop. And the lawyers had never seen this before. So they dictated the letter, she took it, she printed it. So they said, do you want to work full-time again? She had worked full-time for them like 25 years ago. And she said, yes. So she started to do training, because this was WordPerfect for DOS. And she, you know, but she started to train because they were part of a, you know, multi-office system now. She was doing training, and she really loved it. And that computer had moved from her avocation to her vocation. And that, I think, is the key to life. This is the key to life, is when your avocations in life overlap with your vocation, in life. When they do, life is like good. Your job is perfect. You are happy in your job. By avocation means to call away from. What calls you away? Vocation. What calls you away from your normal stuff. That's what avocation means. We think it means like hobby, interest. The things that really interest you are your avocations. Now, vocation I'm using in the sense like vocational school or vocational tech, just that which you do for a job. That's what I mean by vocation. Because that's one of the definitions in Merriam-Webster. Vocation is your job. So in this sense, I'm using vocation in that simple sense of job. But when your job and your interests, your vocation and your avocation are the same, then everything works out. And I think we see that in the life of Teresa of Avila. You know, Teresa of Avila, I think a lot of here have weighed in that their favorite book is The Foundations. My favorite book of Teresa of Avila is Story of Her Life. And early in the story of her life, she's talking about her life in Incarnation, where she is a good nun, doing the work of the convent, doing her duties, you know, and her heart doesn't seem to be in it. It's her vocation, but not her avocation. And she'll write early in her life this line: Lord, I find that I have abandoned you under the pretext of serving you. I think that's exactly what's happened. Her vocation is where she's serving, but her heart's not there. Her avocation isn't there. She's abandoned the Lord under the pretext of serving the Lord. Lord, I have found I have abandoned you under the pretext of serving you. This is not a happy line. This is not a line written by a happy person. That her life is going nowhere, her heart is not there. But then later she has the great Ecce Homo experience, this big conversion. Her, you know, and I loved how she would just, I'm going to sit here until I get what I want, that I'm not going to offend you anymore. I love that kind of prayer. But her life now has vision. Her life now has purpose. Her life now has direction. She has found what she's been called to do. This is where she's finding her energy. I think her vocation and her avocation have finally met. And she can write later in life, in the book, or the story of her life, she writes in the life, labor done in love is not labor at all. Labor done in love is not labor at all. Because that's when avocation and vocation meet. It gives you energy, gives you, and that's why we can have a day like today, where we celebrate labor. Labor is not labor when it's done in love. It is something to celebrate. It's something to rejoice in. It's something that gives us energy, purpose, and meaning when vocation and avocation meet. Yeah, you can have stress in your life. You can have a lot of work. You can go home tired at the end of the day. But it's not labor. Because it's done in love. It's done in your heart. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at in this gospel. You know, he starts off with all the stuff. What are you going to eat? What are you going to wear? What are you going to drink? You know, that's the stuff of vocation, your job. Your job will provide that stuff. But he says, seek God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and these things will be taken care of. God's kingdom and his righteousness, I think, is the avocation part of our lives. That's the stuff that gets us interested. And it doesn't mean like being a nun like Teresa of Avila. I think it means God's kingdom and his righteousness are what God is calling you, calling me to do. That's where his call is. That's where his kingdom is. That's where his righteousness is. That's where it's in our hearts. That he's calling us not to vocation in this gospel. He's calling us to avocation. Find what really, where God has called you, where his kingdom is in your life. Find there. And pursue that. Live there. And these other things, the vocation part, will be added besides. That's when labor, and why this is a feast day. It's a holiday. It's a holy day in many ways. Because when labor reaches there, that is holiness. Because now you're doing the work of God for you. And that is so fulfilling and so enriching and so deepening. I think that's why we can find so many times you've had teachers that have been wonderful teachers. And you've had teachers that are horrible. SSNDs. Because that's where their call is. Vocation and avocation have met. But some, they've never found their heart. Will really charge them. And it's just a job. There's no happiness there. We know religious that way. There have been probably in this convent good nuns and unhappy nuns. What's the difference? I think when vocation and avocation have met. In that beautiful passage from John, that'd be from the spiritual canticle, I think it's stanza 18. He says the same thing. For my every act is love. All my service is done in love. I no longer tend the herd, nor have I any other work, now that my every act is love. That's avocation, vocation, joy. Search your heart. What is God really calling you to? Let's make this a real celebration